Good afternoon, everybody. Here we are in Zoom land yet again for a wonderful dissonance event. My name is Sal Berman. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at the University of Michigan. I'm also a clinical faculty member in the School of Information. In addition, I'm honored to be a part of the Dissonance Organizing Committee. On behalf of this multidisciplinary group of faculty and students, I want to welcome and thank you all for being a part of Dissonance Conversations at the Confluence of Technology, Policy, Privacy, Security, and Law, and this evening's conversation in particular about the film, The Feeling of Being Watched. The Dissonance event series seeks to engage the university community on timely topics of a national and global perspective, increase university-wide multidisciplinary discourse, connect faculty, researchers, and students from across multiple campuses, and provoke thought and discourse, and by the way, have some fun along the way. I'm not going to go through the litany of multidisciplinary parts of the university that make up Dissonance, but suffice to say, they range from the College of Engineering to the medical school, to the School of Information, to the law school, Wallace House, and ITS's Office of Information Assurance and beyond. A couple of housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded, so check the Dissonance webpage later for the recording if you want to watch it or share it with others. During the Zoom webinar, please use the Q&A function to send in your questions. We'll be monitoring it throughout our hour together. Visit the Dissonance website if you want to sign up for or even suggest future events. With the prelude complete, prepare to get a glimpse into the panopticon and engage in a thought-provoking conversation with the director of The Feeling of Being Watched and a small group of experts. Even if you're unable to watch the film during the time we made it freely available, I know you're going to get a lot out of this program. Now let me introduce our moderator and fellow dissonancer, Lynette Clemetson, director of the Wallace House. I'll turn it over to Lynette to introduce our cast and get things moving.
Thank you, Saul. And I like being introduced as a fellow dissonancer. I think that's the first time I've heard that word, but I will wear it with pride. I think it's really important for journalists to be part of the dissonance group because so many of the issues involving privacy and technology intersect with freedom of information and increasingly disinformation and surveillance. And these are all issues that journalists are deeply involved in, which is how I came to know our special guest today, Assia Boundaoui. I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'm going to bring them on one by one. Assia Boundaoui is, I'm sorry, just lost my screen. Assia, there you are. Assia Boundaoui is the filmmaker we've all come here today to talk to. She is an Algerian-American journalist and filmmaker based in Chicago. She's reported for the BBC, NPR, Al Jazeera, Vice, CNN. She's the recipient of First Place Mark for Excellence Award from the Society of Professional Journalists for her reporting in Yemen. She's directed a short film on hijabi hair for salons for the HBO Lenny docuseries, which premiered as an unofficial selection of the 2018 Sundance Film Festival. She has a master's degree in journalism from New York University and is fluent in Arabic. Assia, I came to know Assia because The Feeling of Being Watched won the National Livingston Award for Excellence in National Reporting in 2020. And the film it just unanimously blew all the judges away. And since then, she's come to the university this year as a Knight-Wallace Reporting Fellow. So I'm so proud to have Assia intersecting my orbit in several different ways. And joining us for conversation today, we have Roya Ensafi. Roya, if we can have you join us by video. Roya is Assistant Professor of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on security and privacy with an emphasis on designing techniques and systems to protect users from adversarial networks. She founded and directs the Censored Planet at the University of Michigan. The research lab investigates privacy and security violations on the internet. Thank you for joining us, Roya. And we also have with us here Tanisha Afnan. Tanisha is a Ph.D. student at the School of Information and a member of the Security, Privacy, and Interaction Research Lab. Her work primarily centers around the digital privacy concerns of exposure-sensitive populations, especially those who have been historically subjected to targeted surveillance. And that's, she'll have a lot to say about this film. She's also interested in investigating the role of different social identities, such as religion or gender, in influencing individual digital privacy, expectations, and preferences. So Tanisha and Roya and Assia, I'm so glad to have you here. And Assia, I'm going to jump right in and start with you. I know that you've participated in so many discussions since this film has come out, and you and I have even done discussions before. This one's slightly different. When we've talked about this film in the past with groups and on panels, we've primarily been talking about the film with groups of journalists. And for those of you who don't come from a journalism background, I think this film sparks a lot of conversation because in some ways, as a documentary film, it could be seen as perhaps untraditional in that Assia is squarely, she is a part of the narrative of the movie. And in sort of, some very traditional readings of journalism, the reporter should be apart from the story. And I think that those of us who believe in sort of getting to the truth of a story, believe that there's nobody else who could tell this story the way that Assia could tell it. And so simply being transparent about her positionality is what makes the journalism unassailable. But this group, Assia, is interesting because this is primarily a group of people who study surveillance and privacy and how surveillance and privacy affects different groups of people in different ways. And so I'd like to just start by asking you, when you think about the audience of people brought together by dissonance to watch and react to the film, what you think, and just to get everybody on the same page, because we've all watched it at different times. I think we have the trailer for the film, and if we could run the trailer, it will all just put us on the same page before we start the discussion.
First time we saw a car parked was the fall of 1990. Every time I went for the groceries, I saw the car. I went and dropped off the kids, I saw the car. And we kind of thought that our house was bugged too, that somebody was looking into our house all the time.
When my kids were small, to say, oh, it was the bomb, like that was the really cool thing. That was like the big word, and we couldn't use it. And I had to tell my kids, not almost like a swear word, you don't say that.
You feel like someone's just invading your life, I have a feeling that there is a camera, there is something watching, and you don't feel free, you don't feel safe. I don't remember how it felt to just know that I'm free in my home. This is my home, it's just ours. I don't have that feeling.
It's become to the point where I would call the neighbor across the street if the car is parked over there and say, do you have a visitor that owns a car like that? Mm-hmm. Isn't that terrible? It's crazy.
Do you think you're paranoid?
No, I'm not. Not at all. No, I just think everything it's happening, it's going on, and it's in real life. It's not an imagination, it's not paranoia. Mm-mm.
Wow. So I'm sure we're going to have so many questions. I want to just tell the people joining us today, please use the Q&A function to share your questions with us. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll make sure we get to you. Assia, what do you think? I mean, in some respects, the kind of work that Tanisha and Roya do with, how we're all surveilled through things like this, what you're talking about seems, old school in many ways, just like a car on the street who's watching you all the time. How has your thinking about the subjects that you were exploring in this film changed in the past few years?
Yeah, while you were speaking, I was thinking about Simone Brown. She wrote a great book called Dark Matter, this on the surveillance of Blackness. And she talks about how over time, the distance between the subject of surveillance and the surveiller has grown. So from this like car on the street, this like very obvious physical surveillance to, drone, satellite, and further distance. And so, yeah, like, what we think of as modern day surveillance is very much, online, it's digital, but it's also important to note that the physical surveillance hasn't ended either. There was a heavy surveillance of the FBI of the Black Lives Matter movement, and there was an entire investigation codenamed Black Identity Extremists that the FBI were working on, and there was so much physical surveillance of organizers, of cars pulling up, and cameras and photographs being taken of people, that the physical surveillance, which is something like the panopticon, it is meant for the people to see and to notice, the people being surveilled, is a tactic in itself. This idea that once you think that you're under surveillance, once, then you feel that you're under perpetual surveillance all the time. And that's a state of mind that Foucault talks about, that Fanon talks about, that we opened the film with a quote on. And that's like really old and is still, a tactic that's being used by federal law enforcement. So yeah, things have changed, and some things have not changed at all.
Yeah. Can I bring Roya in, because the work that you're doing now on privacy, so much of what we talk about in terms of surveillance now with modern technology is things that we submit to willingly by clicking or not clicking settings on our phone, or searching and not turning something off in the background, accepting some terms that we haven't read. And that's what leads to surveillance. The feeling of being watched, nobody submitted to anything willingly or unwillingly. And I'm interested in the themes that you reacted to in this film.
So a little bit background about me. I came from Iran, which is a Muslim country, around 2009. So this movie was a movie that the moment I started the first time watching it, I literally shared it with all my Iranian friends in US and just said, you guys, we're not crazy over the past decades. This is the fact that I'm afraid of saying like bomb or other stuff in Farsi in airplanes or whatever is a common trend, among immigrants from Middle East or who knows further. But the movie, I think, highlighted three things that I found you guys, especially you did it beautifully. One was that somehow this pressure of surveillance and the pressure of being a Muslim in US have made us to focus on what not to be and ask for confirmation. You mentioned that I'm just trying my best not to look like something, or I'm lost of knowing who I am because of all the focus I have. And later you mentioned that has led me to, when I'm questioning the guy, I just didn't go, aggressive, asking him the right question because I just wanted to be liked. And that's also, I think, plays in the hands of the powerful governments, that there's not a strong voice against them, because this the way affect activism and the power of standing up. And I really resonate with that. The other part that you beautifully provided evidence of, which I didn't know, was how many different ways you receive responses for FOIA requests. And the email, the letters and the writings of us were different. So to me, I was like, is this a premeditated approach? Because or is it really, how come this is, I really wanted to be in the head of the people who are writing this, to know that, is there there isn't a structural way or procedures to make the law, FOIA law, actually be practical, and it's stated as a policy that is assume no one is going to actually taking it to the court, or this is actually for you guys like that. And then I found that the beauty of crowdsourcing it, the beauty of pressure of community. And I think when you talked about and I think highlighted by many of them, many of the people, that the paranoia and the truth is such a blurry way, I found the strength of the community that you showed beautifully, that your mom also highlighted throughout the years, that without that, the strength of that community, I don't think the community would have flourished. Rather, I would worry more. Like, I mean, one thing that I loved was you said the things that these guys are considered dangerous is the characterization of the community. And that also like highlight, like anyway, the part that my heart sank was when Bob called you or visited your mom. Like, I was just like, oh, this is scary. Like, I hope never happened to me. So these are highlights that I got from feeling, not research, but through my feeling and observing and watching your movie.
And Roya, can I just ask, because you said, feeling and not through research, can you talk a little bit more about, as somebody who spends all of your time actually looking at how surveillance and tracking is a part of our lives, the difference between sort of studying data and seeing Bob come to Assia's mother's door, and how what that changes for you in terms of the way you internalize or analyze the situation.
I think Assia highlighted that also in her movie, which is the moment she received the Google alert, which I have received also. I've studied China, I've studied Russia heavily, I've studied other governments, and I have been target of nation state threats. And when the surveillance actually show it to you, like in a clear context that you're under surveillance, like it goes from the paranoia or truth to closer to the spectrum of truth. Then she mentioned it's become isolating. I don't know how to communicate that to people. Should I email people? I honestly ask this question constantly, that, well, I want to know about this phenomenon you're studying right now, for example, how Russia does this stuff. Should I email people? Because I know I am under surveillance. So should I do something? How can I do that? Which tools are going to be useful? And through my research, I've reached the conclusion that assumption of surveillance is there, and the data is going to be leaked unless you're basically just only using Signal or end-to-end encryption messaging, and that's it. Even with that, I question, but it's just making you feel like hopeless to some degree. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. And I think that the sense of both, on the one hand, hopeless that you can't control this, and yet the movie, as you pointed out, surfaces such a strong community and so much joy and so much community in spite of everything that is happening around it, which is so powerful to see. And Tanisha, you study social identities and how communities both respond to expectations and violations of privacy based on their social identity and how they're targeted. Can you talk a bit about what you saw in particular in this film and what it made you think about?
Yeah, I'd love to. So like Roya, my background is I'm also Muslim American. So this is a particular community that I've have personal investment in. And I've done 2 studies now working specifically with Muslim American women and in different contexts and what digital privacy concerns they have and what threats they feel. And this film was amazing because I just saw so many parallels and like the same sentiments echoed, even in this different kind of form of surveillance or violation of privacy. So like the censorship thing, Roya was saying this too, I think we all kind of feel this chilling effect almost as a result of, this now at this point in history, we've seen that this type of surveillance has happened. It was large in scale, and I'm sure everyone has like personal anecdotes and experiences that they can relate to that drive this kind of paranoia that help us censor what we want to say, and that exists online too, even in what I've seen with participants, even in sending personal text messages to one person. People are wary of saying the wrong thing or scared somehow, even if they don't necessarily understand the exact data flow or transmission, people are still just concerned that anything is fair game. And I think that exists because of like the lack of transparency, like what Assia was saying. There's more and more distance between the surveyors and those who are surveyed. And I think this creates like this kind of opacity around how things are collected and how they're used and how they're accessed. And I think that just feeds into more paranoia, unfortunately. But as far as like my own personal reactions to the documentary, I totally agree with Roya. One thing that really stood out to me was that, the FBI was targeting this particular community for 2 characteristics that define almost like all Muslim communities, which is that we're charitable and philanthropic, and then that we're also very tightly woven and interconnected. And you can characterize that in different negative ways, like calling us insular or whatever the case may be. And it was really interesting to me that like the framing of it can be taken in so many different ways. And these characteristics that I think are things to be proud of, or that are like some of the strongest features of our community, were also what made us most vulnerable. But the other thing, I think the overall framing of it that was really interesting to me was that the surveillance began, or the focus on the fact that the surveillance began in the 90s. And literally only 10 years after, I think, the foundation was created. And that was super interesting to me because I feel like the media narrative, and also even what's kind of present in a lot of scholarly literature too, is that we think that counterterrorism initiatives started following 9/11 as a reactionary thing, as like a response to it, when it was actually clearly happening way before it. So I found that very interesting and really, really like eye-opening.
Yeah, I want to talk about responses because, it's interesting to all 3 of you through your work are, yes, you sort of live in a world where these things are in some ways obvious and pervasive, but you're all doing work in your own ways to be empowered by technology and to take back some control over information. Roya, can you talk a little bit about your work with Citizen Lab and what it's for, and who has access to that work?
So in general, I think when we measure censorship, like half of my career was about like trying to measure censorship globally and trying to understand how the intermediary which does the censorship, being the government's Great Firewall China or a regional censorship by ISP, how do they do that and design tools to be able to go around the censorship? The key thing here is censorship at network level was measurable because there was a sign to either the block page you see or the connection disappears. So you could measure having that signal. From the technical perspective, the surveillance game and measuring that is extremely complicated because one, the ISPs, internet service provider like Comcast and Verizon's, and many network that your traffic pass through them, they all collect data from your traffic, especially if it's unencrypted. That means your DNS traffic, which is like, I want to go to the google.com, give me the IP. Doing so will give the ISP information about what domains you are going to. And so these ISPs collect this data. We all know about them, that is being monetized. We know about governments use those data. But it has been a decade of fight about encrypting the traffic. The problem is, right now we have companies like NSO, surveillance company in Israel, which is going after the client side. And we have platforms being so powerful that they go share data with the governments and do takedowns. For the malwares that are being installed on the client side, well, the game is very dangerous, because if this company is developing this and the government's actually buying data from them or buying the technology and going after dissonance and voices in the community, Citizen Lab honestly is the only institute that has the technical means to find and call them on it, and has done a great job on that. They forced Finn Fisher, one of the companies that has been active in that, to be bankrupt. But when it comes to the platform, like I'm talking about Google's and Facebook's and Twitter's and all, what we have is transparency reports or magic side channels that I can develop that with so much pain to be able to prove that these companies actually do takedowns on the request of government. The transparency reports that somewhat they have to inform community about is very vague, and it's extremely useless. It's basically 6 months aggregated on Yemen or other governments asking for this much takedown, or US governments, and they don't give you information. Even the bar is so low for this platform to be transparent about who they share data with and how this data is being used by the government, on which is the subpoena actually, nothing. We don't hear about that part at all.
But we should stipulate, because I know we have many students listening today, even the terminology that we have, I will just say this, the things that are supposed to bring us transparency, or the laws, the things that are supposed to be the levers that we have to pull, actually are not designed to put the power in the hands of citizens. The Freedom of Information Act is designed to give you as little information as possible, and almost no useful information, right? It is, and the work that Assia is doing in the Knight-Wallace Fellowship now is, it's a sort of very radical response to all of the FOIA documents that she had. So technically, the government responded, right? Assia, you should talk about how many documents you have and what it actually amounts to. It amounts to no freedom of information. It amounts to sort of doubling down on just how much information is being withheld. So I don't know, Assia, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, there's so much that you all have said. First of all, thank you so much, Roya and Tanisha, for your words. I really appreciate your thoughtful reflections. And I just was taking a lot of notes, speaking of the spyware, there was an article that came out earlier this year about the FBI buying Pegasus, right? The Pegasus Israeli spyware, and testing it for domestic surveillance, and then passing on it or not, so who knows, right? Who knows what we know. But so there is this direct funnel and relationship between these private technology surveillance companies, for-profit companies that are directly selling to all, law enforcement, all kinds of governments, repressive governments all over the place, to track human rights defenders, to track journalists, et cetera. So it's yeah, it's so clear when you see like, oh, like this particularly like really infamous spyware that's been used against, so many people is like also being used, here for domestic surveillance. So it's like this whole conflation and this like, interesting tunnel between the private sphere and government. So I also wanted to say, just off the bat, because this is, dissonance, that I really try to be careful about conflating surveillance and privacy. That like oftentimes when we talk about surveillance, we talk about like privacy is the only thing at stake here. And it's not. And like, if you watch the film, you understand that it's like people's livelihoods are at stake, people's like, status to stay in a country legally is at stake. People's, people are incarcerated based on this. So all of these like faceted impacts, direct and indirect, on the community, on people being surveilled, and that privacy is just one of them, right? And so it's really important when we talk about surveillance that we're not just saying it's about protecting your privacy, it's about protecting your livelihood, about your ability to stay with your family, to live in the home that you live in, et cetera. Entire people's lives were destroyed through surveillance. So important not to conflate, I think, those two. And then, when you were talking, Roya, about the service providers and like, all of the companies, it was very interesting. I really always point to Edward Snowden and the leaks as a really defining moment, because I was working on The Feeling of Being Watched for 5 years, and I started before Snowden leaks came out. And before that, people like thought I was kind of like I was conspiratorial, that it was wild to even suggest such a thing happened that I was suggesting. And then after Snowden, like it was taken at face value that this, what I've been talking about had happened, that there is this like mass surveillance domestically of Americans. So there was really a moment where that came into, and one of the things that came out in the Snowden revelations was, there's a famous AT&T building in Tribeca in New York City, codenamed Titan Point, and it is the place that all of international calls are like channeled through for AT&T, and that's been that's an NSA hub for monitoring that connection. So so a lot of these revelations about these like Verizon and AT&T and these like, and their actual like buildings and service providers being named as these hybrid government private service provider, like surveillance headquarters. So anyway, that made me think about what you were talking about with service providers. But sorry, Lynette, I just was responding to everything.
No, it all needs to be responded to. And I really, I'm glad you made the point about separating out privacy from the social effects of surveillance, and that sort of that government harassment, and that is, and it really, marginalizes whole communities.
Right. And it's like very much kind of like based on some classism and based on some racism, because people of color are surveilled differently than white people in this country, that different people are surveilled differently based on the intersection of where they like lay on the hierarchy, the class and racial hierarchy in this country. So all of those things are really important. So maybe while, a white American might just be worried about privacy, a Black American or, an immigrant or someone undocumented is thinking about a whole bunch of other things other than privacy. So, and then also like, there's this quote that I talk about all the time by Deepa Kumar, who's written a brilliant book on Islamophobia. And she says, the opposite of surveillance is not privacy. The opposite of surveillance is community. And that goes back to what you were talking about, Roya, that like, if not for the community, where how would have this investigation, all of the negative effects, how would they have landed on people? And it's that because, if you think about the panopticon and the metaphor of the panopticon, this idea is to isolate, right? The individual, that not only do you feel constantly watched, you can't see the other people in the panopticon, So the opposite of that is to be able to not only watch back and to be able to see into, the opacity of the surveiller, but to also look around at the other people that are being surveilled, right? So so this idea that like the alienation, all of these like effects that come from feeling like you're under surveillance are countered by community, by talking out loud about things. What you said, Roya, really hit me early on. I'm not crazy. Like when you watch the film, you messaged your friends and you're like, look, like we're not crazy. And this is like one of the most pernicious things about surveillance and FOIA and transparency is that in preventing disclosure and preventing transparency, it's a way of gaslighting people, so you can't even say that this happened. And one of the biggest impacts of the film was to just validate that, like, hey, like what you felt, what you thought was happening, like you aren't crazy. This is happening. And there's 100-year-long history of, the FBI doing exactly this. My puppy is dreaming and barking in his dreams right now.
I think, if I may, I have 2 points that I think it's really important. One is the degree of surveillance and how different minority groups are subject to more surveillance or different degree. And from technical perspective, I think and we are studying this right now, is when you immigrate from, let's say, China or Iran or somewhere else to US, even because you still have dependencies there, you come with the apps, you come with the softwares that developed homegrown in those regions. As a result, they are not usually use a strong encryption, or they might not have even encryption. And that by itself, my research right now is, can we look at the ISP's traffic, a good ISP that let us do that, to be able to see how many people in that ISP are actually subject to malware injection attack in that ISP because they're running a software or running an app that is regional to them. And I remember something in Turkey happened once, that there was an app about when the time of prayer is, and the developer of that app actually did something that left the fingerprint in the traffic going back and forth to that app that makes specific people who download that app vulnerable. So you can see that from...
Sorry, Roya, you mean an app that helps people?
A Muslim prayer app,
app.
Times that many Muslim people had downloaded.
Yes.
So you can, and that's exactly why one of the premise of, one of the goal that I have in my research is that security, privacy, or whatever we are imagining should be think about at a scale. You should not think about securing specific people or you should think about for everybody. It has to be technical means that we have in the US, for example, we upgrade our apps, we uphold some of our platform to a higher standard. That needs to be the same for other people, because otherwise these groups are subject to a lot more of different, even surveillance than the rest. And I think that.
But Tanisha, I'm sure that in your work you see over and over again, and there's been a lot written about this in recent years. Anything that is developed with the biases of the society that it is built for. There's no, if we have, as you were talking, Assia, I was thinking about Isabel Wilkerson's book Caste, and the way the society is structured, deeply coded structurally. And so then when you get to actual, software development, coding, building things, all of those social structures are built in. So how do you, I almost feel, Roya, when I'm listening to you say, oh, it should be that for it should be the same for everyone. Is that even possible? Tanisha?
Yeah, so I would love to talk about that. I think what we see a lot of the times is that when these systems are being created, or when these platforms and things are all being developed and designed, developers and designers have like an objective user they're envisioning for whom they're designing their products for. And more times than not, this, you know, hypothetical user is unfortunately going to reflect the experiences of the developer and the designer in a lot of ways, maybe unconsciously, maybe intentionally. And those are the needs they're anticipating. Those are the privacy threats, harms, and like risks they're anticipating when they're creating these products. What is really important to recognize, like that Roya and Assia both keep highlighting, is that fact that different communities, different people, and different individuals have very, very different privacy needs and very, very different privacy consequences that result when these needs aren't met and when like these needs are violated. So yeah, I think creating things that work for everyone may not exist in the sense of like creating universal guidelines or products, but rather in creating more granular controls, giving people more autonomy in different ways because different people have different needs. But also going back to what Assia was saying about like thinking about a violation of privacy as the only direct harm of something like surveillance. Yeah, that's absolutely not the case. It's what I've constantly been seeing in the work that I've been doing with like Muslim American women. One was like specifically thinking about the hiring context and women who are, you know, in the job seeking process. A huge concern for a lot of these women were just like, you know, am I going to be able to like secure employment? Is my like status as like a visible Muslim, like a hijab wearing Muslim or whatever, all going to impact my hiring outcomes? And whether or not that is the case, which there have been a lot of like meta analyses of different studies like looking at hiring discrimination, and you know, it is often the case, but even if it was not the case, that should not be a thought that people have and have to navigate with and develop strategies for, like, you know, taking their profile pictures off of different platforms when they're in the job seeking process and stuff like that. Like, there should be controls built into these systems that give people this type of agency and autonomy without forcing, you know, this kind of labor onto the individuals themselves.
I want to make sure we have time for questions. We've got a question here from Omar. And Assia, I do want you though to answer, because the film stops at a certain place. You have continued to receive documents from your FOIA requests after. I think it's important for people to know where all of that stands now and how many documents you have and what you're trying to do with them.
I have 30, well, the government was compelled by the federal judge to release all 33,000 pages, which comprise the Operation Vulgar Betrayal investigation. Of those 33,000 pages, the FBI redacted, you know, 20,000 pages in full. And of the 10,000 that I did receive, they're full of white holes, like Swiss cheese. So it's been really like, you know, that really hit me, Lynette, when you were talking about like the FOIA is not a law that actually, you know, intended to, I mean, it had an intention. The way it is translated by the federal, you know, agencies that actually have to disclose information is very different. And the FBI is, you know, does everything to prevent disclosure. And so, you know, has been really heavy-handed in the redactions. And that's been incredibly frustrating to me as a journalist, to feel like, you know, I went to war for transparency and like I won, but I lost also. And then also to just like, again, put into perspective, like how much an agency that has invested so much time in these kinds of investigations and in, you know, targeting communities of color specifically, and like historically, like why would they ever, you know, disclose information that would actually, you know, could hold them accountable for these practices. And so there's like a vested interest in the Bureau, in the agency, not disclosing this information, even though it's historical. At this point, we're talking about, 30 years old, right? And still, I'm still actively in my lawsuit. It's 2022. It started in 2016. So we're like 6 years into this lawsuit. I'm still arguing over the public right to know, and that actually, it's not just a journalistic goal. And this is something we've said in our lawsuit over and over again, that there's actually a relationship between truth and healing. And if you look at the history of, truth and reconciliation commissions all over the world, from South Africa to Rwanda, to many countries, like there's actually been studies that people who, even if there isn't like justice or anybody held accountable, just to know the truth about what happened, about the thing that harmed you, is enough to decrease PTSD in a population. Okay. So people feel like they've gone through a process. So I've tried to bring that process, because we talk a lot about, like the tangible harms of surveillance, but there is all of these intangible harms as well. And, the community is collectively traumatized by these decades of surveillance. And so, and then they're also at the same time prevented from knowing all the truth about what happened there. And so what does it mean? I've thought about a lot about what does it mean to seek repair without having all of the truth, and to move through, and what does it mean also beyond the, like looking at the secret archive and the bureaucratic archive and thinking about like the subaltern meaning of the archive, which is like that, the FBI collected all of this information about us. But if you look at the archive as a whole, it tells you a lot about the authors of it and the FBI, as much as it does tell you a very distorted version about who we are. So looking at it in that respect has helped me to understand more things, but it's been supremely frustrating. So my two responses to this lack of disclosure has been, on the one hand, think about how technology and artificial intelligence in particular can help compel a radical transparency in these records. Like, what if instead of requesting from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, like transparency, how can we use historical records, the fact that these investigations are part of a historical legacy of the FBI doing these kinds of investigations, and use technology together to help us kind of fill in the blanks on what's been redacted and what's been missing, on a very like basically providing a historical context to these like dehistoricized documents. And on the other hand, I've been thinking a lot about emotional truths and the memory and the archive of the community. And how do we juxtapose that? And, instead of responding to the documents, what does it mean to help facilitate a community archive that can sit alongside the FBI's archive? And so there's, I've been working on a co-creation project in Bridgeview. I moved back to Chicago to do this, where we're collecting an extensive archive from the community itself in this like particular period of the 90s. And for the first time asking, the community, like, what do you want to preserve about yourself? What is worth remembering? And what, can you share your own historical records with us? And we're compiling this all together and creating, part of the work is to create an art installation using the 30,000 documents. And, basically there's an augmented reality, an AR app that we're designing, where you can put your phone up to one of the redacted spaces in the FOIA documents, and out of it will come a home video, a piece of the community archive. So thinking of these redactions not just as places of disappeared information, but places of possibility for like the glitch, for the community story that's been erased, that's been undermined, to come through. And so I'm like, okay, they're frames. Let me think about them as frames. And so also really pushing the boundaries of journalism, like that when you're confronted with this lack of disclosure in this way, what are different ways of responding? What are other ways of getting at a fuller picture when the FBI is like not going to be transparent? So I've been working at it and chipping away at it in all these different ways, but that's what I'm working on right now, is like thinking of like the fuller story and what does it mean to preserve things. And if one of the harms of the surveillance, by the way, is not just that we were watched without our consent, is that the information collected about us is being held in perpetuity by the FBI and shared by every other agency, in this country, and possibly with foreign governments as well, right? There's evidence of that in the record itself. So what does that mean to create a counter archive that sits also in perpetuity alongside this? So that's what I'm working on now.
It's very powerful work. Omar asks, what organizations and initiatives do you suggest we support to work together to fight this government aggression? And all three of you can answer this, and then but I want to move through the answers quickly, and maybe we can put some things in the chat, and then we'll bring in some other questions.
I can jump in real quick to say that, in organizing the impact campaign around the film, I, talked with a lot of organizers working on surveillance measures. And I would say there's a great, because surveillance of Muslim communities has also transformed over the years. There's a program called CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, which tries to kind of like a franchise the surveillance to like schools and mental health clinics and community centers, and asks them to self-report on members of the community. So great organization is the Muslim Justice League out of Boston, who's working specifically on the CVE angle. Here in Chicago, there is a movement to counter audio surveillance of the Chicago Police Department with a private company called ShotSpotter. That does it not just in Chicago, but all over the country. So there's a Stop ShotSpotter campaign that's happening specifically in Chicago. And there's another organization in LA that's doing really interesting work at the intersection of like surveillance in schools. And it's called Stop LAPD Spying, an incredible organization that talks about building power, not paranoia. In communities of color that are surveilled, and in unhoused communities also in Los Angeles that are very heavily surveilled. So those are just three I'll throw out there.
I can mention a few that I've worked with too. So ISPU is the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. And then also like in the Metro Detroit area, Access is like a huge one. That's the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services. Here at U of M, we've got the Global Islamic Studies Center, which has been really helpful in collaborating with me on like getting the word out about some of my studies and giving me feedback on things like that. But yeah, I really want to highlight the importance of this community organization facet, because one of the things that really stood out to me in the documentary too was the fact that there's been this onus on a lot of Muslim Americans to uphold this like model representative kind of persona in order to like lift the burden, like lift this like suspicious eye away from us and make us more palatable to like the mainstream American values or whatever the case may be. But that's exhausting for a lot of people, and as has been shown in the documentary, unsuccessful in getting surveillance off of us or this othering phenomena away from us. It's not working. So I think calling out authority and collective organization work and moving towards actually challenging like the kind of status quo at this moment is really important.
I want to acknowledge there have been some questions in the Q&A, but I had a group of questions sent to me directly. One of Assia's fellow Knight-Wallace fellows, Erica Hayasaki, who's joining us from California, had her undergrad journalism students watch the film, and we have several students today. And we're not going to be able to get to your questions, but your questions are so smart, and I want to just acknowledge each of you individually: Danica, Alexi, Isabella, Brian, Kai, Fernanda, Autumn, Valerie, Sabrina, Reiko, Chloe. Thank you for your questions. And there are a couple I'm going to collapse for Assia that have to do with the journalism style. And because you guys were so thoughtful to write out your questions, Assia mentioned to me beforehand that she loves these questions, that they're so great. So she will answer them and we'll send back answers through Erica. But I want to make sure we get a couple in, and there are a couple of questions, Assia, that talk about the style of the filmmaking and your choice to really build in some of these beautiful interactions with your family in a way that humanizes not just your family, but the whole community. And also, and so Alexi mentions, you know, there are moments where your family is sitting on the porch, talking, cooking, doing everyday things. And she asks, can you talk about your choices to include everyday scenes? And then Kai asks, he liked the contrast between the brighter parts of your life and the darker sides of paranoia in the sort of the filmmaking style. There's a section of the film displaying Assia celebrating with her community with bright lighting to cut to a scene where the shadow overtakes the neighborhood, followed by several rapid cuts highlighting paranoia concerning privacy and surveillance. And can you talk about this theme? And so how you chose to both reflect your family and your decision to do that, and what you were trying to communicate in the tone of the film.
Yeah, thank you guys again for those questions, and to everyone in Erica's class. I'll try to answer them briefly because I know we're close on time. So, well, the first thing to say is that, you know, it took 5 years to make this film. And for the first 2 years, I was making it very much behind the camera. It was not a personal film. I was being a good journalist and standing behind the camera and pointing the mic at other people. And then like 2 years into that, I realized that that was not the best way to make this film, or even the most honest way to make the film, because my questions were personal as much as they were, you know, investigative ones, and where I was coming from was very important. And so I made the very difficult decision to pull myself in front of the camera, a very uncomfortable decision. I'm still uncomfortable with it, but I feel, you know, I say this all the time, I don't believe in objectivity. I believe in transparency. And I realized that the only way to tell this story was to show the process, because I didn't know what would happen. So showing the investigative process, showing, you know, the things I was grappling with, you know, not just as a journalist, but as a person going on this journey was really important. And also that's how I was going to get at the feeling of being watched, is by showing that bit. I think in terms of like showing my family in ordinary moments, that was really important to me. I really like, there's a whole philosophical debate in film about this human empathy model of making films. And I actually I've just written a whole article about the problem with humanizing frames, because who needs to humanize who? And if you need to make a whole entire film to make someone look like a human, there's a real problem in the first place. And there's a whole power dynamic implicit on who needs to be humanized for who. So, you know, my approach is that there is, you know, a dearth of representations of Muslims that don't depict us as monsters. We're either actually often shown as victims or villains. In most films. And there have been studies at USC Annenberg and many, many folks that have studied this specifically. And so for me, as a Muslim filmmaker, you know, as a person of color, I'm creating culture to reflect that back to other Muslims, other people of color, other people who do not see themselves represented on screen. So it's not to humanize us to the larger mainstream, but to create mirrors, you know, to create mirrors where someone can see themselves represented in all of their wholeness. And so it was very important to show everyday life and to you know, reflect that back to ourselves also, that it's not all slogging through and heavy. And there's also these moments of joy. There's this beautiful moments of connection and community, and all of that is all wrapped up in one. So it was important for me to create those mirrors so other people can see themselves reflected back.
I want to slip in one more, because there's another cluster of questions just about your process, Assia, and the scene where you're sort of you're laying down on your mom's lap, and you're really frustrated, and there are these moments when you think you've won, in front of the court, and then other moments where you're just very defeated and exhausted. And so there are a couple of questions about, did you ever want to quit? Were you ever scared? Does this stick with you? I know the answer to that one. You should answer that one for sure. How has it affected you? And I think this answer is particularly important for the young journalists who are joining us, because people want to do work that they feel is important, that they have some sort of personal connection to, but that there's a lot of vulnerability in approaching a project the way you did.
Yeah, I think that's the key word, vulnerability, which is so uncomfortable, right? But that was what it required, I think, to be able to tell this really honestly, and then also to show, I think actually the students, I never really put my finger on it, but they honed in on it in one of their questions, where they're talking about how it translates into being a journalist. So much of the process that I show in the film is about being a journalist of color, and what it means to go and interview and ask hard-hitting questions to people in positions of power, to law enforcement, how some of that baggage about how you're seen enters into the space, how it, how you have to negotiate that. I think that's all very real. We don't talk enough about it, but I think as a filmmaker and as a journalist, so much of our job is asking other people to be vulnerable, to talk about the most difficult moments in their lives, and wait, let's make sure the cameras are on, and wait, let me fix your mic, and so we ask a lot of our subjects as journalists, as documentarians. And I think that there's something to be said about holding ourselves to that same kind of ask. It's a real difficult one, about knowing what it means when you make that kind of ask of someone. And I think for me, that might have been the most transformative thing. How am I different now? It is having made myself, a subject, even though I'm authoring the work, right? There's a different kind of power that comes with that. And really, really it sinking into my bones, the responsibility and that comes with asking people certain questions, and asking people to, tear themselves open, to tell a story, and to relate, traumatic moments in their lives. And so I think that I hold that responsibility very heavily. And I think that also there's a protectiveness as journalists from standing behind the camera, from standing behind the mic, where we don't want to necessarily interrogate. It's too uncomfortable to interrogate what, how we stand in relationship to the story that we're telling, or what it's bringing up for us. And I think that as a journalistic practice of being in right relationship with our subjects, with the people we're telling stories about, it's a good practice to be able to be vulnerable in that same way, to interrogate those things, to talk out loud about those things, to kind of confuse a little bit this very distinct separation we want to have from the people we're telling stories about, and to realize that we're actually people too. They're telling, to collapse that distance a little bit. And I think that will lead to more authentic storytelling, to more honest journalism, and also will cause we have a massive crisis that people don't trust the news, people don't trust journalism. And I think part of regaining the public's trust in journalism, part of the process of even battling disinformation, is to be more honest and more vulnerable as journalists, and to collapse that distance that we seem to have between, our protagonists or our subjects, participants, whatever you want to call them, and ourselves.
That was a beautiful answer, and I think not just the journalists on the call, but everybody, that was a beautiful and meaningful answer for everybody joining us from their perspectives. We're going to wrap up, but I just want to note for people, Assia, you made a comment earlier about to the question of what does it mean to have to show someone as human, and what are you responding to when you start to think about that. I also think it's important, as much as we at Wallace House stand up for journalism, one of the things you and I, Assia, have talked about is the fact that when you were earlier in your journalism career and you would go to investigative journalism conferences, you were actually told that you could not be an investigative journalist working on national security issues because you were too close to the issues, you were too close to the communities that you wanted to cover, and which is a damaging answer. It's an answer that actually kept you from doing journalism that would have been very beneficial, and you made the decision that to pursue this, you needed to do it independently. And I just think that we need to have transparency about that too, because as we look at the institutions that control our perceptions about society, journalism is certainly one of them. And so part of our work in supporting the role of journalism in society is also to talk in a transparent way about things that journalism needs to look at clearly about itself, and things that news organizations can be doing better. And so I'm glad that you had the perseverance to pursue this work over several years and to continue to pursue it. And for people watching who want to step into this kind of investigative work, because of your example, I think that you're helping us move forward in a number of ways. So thank you for your work. Tanisha and Roya, thank you for your work and your perspectives. And somebody made a comment that it was actually a very powerful hour, like seeing the three of you women talk about these issues in this way. And I would second that. And Saul, it's been very meaningful to have Dissonance lift up this conversation. And I hope that the recording will be shared and people can come to it after. And Assia, the film is being shown again on PBS, correct?
Yes, it is streaming for free all month on PBS. I'll drop the link in the chat. So if you've missed it, or if you want to share it with anyone, now's the time to do it.
The Feeling of Being Watched by Assia Boundaoui. And Saul, I'll turn it back over to you to close.
I got nothing. This was amazing. A powerful, uplifting in on a subject matter that is anything but. So thank you, all of you. Assia, I wish you were here for this so I could say thanks in person. Lynette, as always, you were brilliant. Tanisha, great to virtually meet you. Roya had to step away. That a panel like this with 4 women of color on the day that we have the first African-American woman
Not a small thing.
onto the Supreme Court is just stirring to me. So thank you, Dissonance Land. We will be in touch with our next offering. So please stay tuned. If you have ideas, reach out to us. Thanks for staying with us. And Lynette and gang, can't thank you enough. It was wonderful.
Thank you all.